I am an architect engineer, graduated out of Cairo University School of Engineering, Architecture Department 1964. Started teaching in Cairo University as a young lecturer, then moved from architecture to city planning and urban planning. And from there moved to Harvard University, where I shifted in scale towards regional planning. And from that got into economics, and then from economics into education, because I believe that people are the heart of all development processes. And after graduating with a PhD from Harvard University in 1972, I had been working and supporting myself through my graduate degrees by practicing as an urban planner in the United States, but also by continuously also teaching and writing in relation to architecture and urban planning. I then came to the World Bank after, like I said, 7 or 8 years of practice in architecture and urban planning in the US. And there at the bank I started in education, moved on to dealing with the countries of the Middle East and North Africa, in particular the oil countries for a number of years, and then moved on to become the division chief for urban projects at the World Bank, and then moved on to other responsibilities such as director and now vice president of the World Bank. In all of this period I've been very focused on the issues of poor people and of environment, both natural and built environment. In particular, I would say that I've maintained a steady affiliation with architecture and urban planning through lecturing, criticism, publications. I've published about 10 books in architecture and maybe about 40 or 50 articles in book chapters and so on, dealing with architectural issues, housing issues, urban planning issues and the like. And I retain a strong interest. I've mostly been in the academic part of architecture, though I did practice for a very brief period, working with an established firm for about a little under a year. Most of my work, however, practice has been in urban planning, urban design, rather than architecture. It was a very interesting part of the issues that interested me at the time. It's a combination of art and science. It's a combination of concern for the environment and for people. It's concern with the creative as well as with the didactic. And the architecture and the built environment are really the mirror, the physical mirror of the social, cultural, economic, technological foundations of a society. And it all comes together in that thing which we call architecture and the built form. The built form is broader than architecture, because architecture thinks in terms of individual buildings, but urban design, urban planning, rural planning, regional planning looks at the built form in relation to the environment as well. It is very much people-centered. I think without question we were torn in those years, which was for me 59 to 64, between two trends. One was the giants of 20th century architecture, such as Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, etc. And their achievements, which of course were written up everywhere. But the other side of the paradigm presented by Hassan Fathy. And to me, Hassan Fathy was a very special person. And he was not lecturing at the university, so we used to go and meet with him at his house 2 or 3 times a week, have tea with him and hear him discourse in the afternoon about everything from art to culture to design to architecture to built form to music. And it was kind of an influence by osmosis. His ideas were very appealing, his designs were remarkable. And I consider it a privilege to have had a chance to participate in the first major book that was issued about Hassan Fathy, which was a Myanmar book by Dar Rastofer, Sir James Richards and myself. It was a year later followed by the book by James Steele and then by other books and so on. But I consider it a privilege to have been able to pay homage to a truly great individual. Well, it started by a really visionary approach by His Highness the Aga Khan, who concerned about the built environment of Muslims around the Muslim world, seeing in fact a situation where the concerns of the poor were not addressed, where authenticity was not reflected, where the loss of a heritage was at risk every day. Decided to seek out a group of intellectuals to help him form an approach, and he had this idea of a prize that would premiate high quality work. And among the founding members on the first steering committee were distinguished people like Hassan Fathi and Oleg Grabar, Bill Porter, and other people as well. Renata Holod was the first convener of that group. And they basically decided what sort of avenues they should look at. And there was a number of possible avenues, and they opened up and staked out the domain of concerns in a series of seminars in which I participated, in 2 or 3 of them in Amman and elsewhere, in Fas and so on. And in that first cycle, they gave the world a chance to look at what would come out. Master jury then, an independent body from the steering committee, really surprised everybody by putting such a big emphasis both on the social projects, compound improvement programs, slum upgrading and so on, as well as historic conservation, with the more conventional view of what an architectural prize should be, buildings like the Intercontinental in Saudi Arabia, for example. With buildings that were also unusual, like the Kuwait water towers. And these were the first selection. And this really established the approach of the award in terms of pluralism. And it was then sort of elaborated by successive master juries and steering committees. Steering committees set the issues, and the master juries bring their own individual perception to that. And I've had the privilege of serving on both more than once. Well, like all awards, they are partly to recognize excellence and partly to help shape a climate of opinion by premiating or giving a prize to things that are deemed to be worthwhile. And as a result, therefore, practitioners and clients and so on look at things differently as a result of the presence of these awards. Mm-hmm. I have heard a governor in a developing country talking to his staff and saying, you know, after seeing a ceremony of the American Awards for architecture in this country, saying, I want you to do the kinds of projects that will win prizes like that. Well, that's an interesting observation.
Yes.
I think it has also served to give a platform for some young talent to be recognized, which would not have otherwise been recognized as broadly perhaps or as quickly. I mean, Abdul Wahid al-Wakil was a fairly young person when he won a prize. Ali Shuaibi was very young when he won a prize. I mean, there are a number of people who were very young when they won such prizes. And by so doing, I think, you know, you create both a climate of opinion, you reward excellence, you help set standards. But in the case of the Aga Khan Award, it is also an educational process as to the nature of architectural criticism. Well, I mean, the jury, of course, makes a collective decision. And as such, part of the chairman's responsibility is not just to participate as a member of the jury, but also to help bring out the collective consensus. Mm-hmm. And the consensus is never easy. This is one of the hardest and most difficult juries to serve on. Definitely among the most interesting, because the Aga Khan Award deals with existing buildings. They have to be 2 years in existence and not more than 25. So this is the balance that you look at. So you're looking at actually existing buildings. But you're comparing, therefore, a vacation villa for a wealthy individual versus a mud brick structure in a remote area versus a conservation project in an old town versus an environmentally sound approach to do this participatory plan, and big fancy buildings as well, a high-tech tower building. And it's this multiplicity of factors that makes the jury a very difficult jury, a very rich jury, in the sense that you're not simply comparing same solutions to the same site, and you look at exactly the same drawing, solution after solution, which is more conventional, with many other juries I've participated in, you're really comparing a lot of apples and oranges and trying to come to their essence and assess that. I think that my unusual background in the sense of being grounded in architecture and engineering, working in urban planning, and then in development issues more broadly, plus a very broad range of active participation in criticism and in social and economic as well as other issues, environmental issues, has helped me to bring an enrichment to that kind of discussion and debate in these juries. The criteria are sketched out by the steering committee, and they're quite detailed and clear-cut. They tend to want excellence, architectural excellence in expression, as well as social content, as well as relevance to the uniqueness of the heritage of these societies, the Muslim societies. That last part is defined very, very broadly, so that even the Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris, which is a building that in fact tries to express the cultural bridge between European societies and the Arab world, predominantly Muslim society, was recognized. Buildings that are in non-Muslim countries but that are inspired by Muslim heritage, such as the Mughal Sheraton, have been recognized. Buildings by non-Muslim in predominant Muslim societies have been recognized. So that criterion is a broad cultural one. It's not a narrow one. And I think the social types of projects have special criteria in terms of replicability, effectiveness, relevance, affordability, and the like. And all these criteria are spelled out in detail. Mm-hmm. But then each jury also brings its own perspective. And our last jury, which I chaired in '95, came up with the idea that we must recognize innovation. Because in a time of great change, innovation is important. It's not just excellence. And frequently, the innovative idea doesn't come born completely with perfection. It grows with time. And the first innovator, the one who takes the risk, should in fact be recognized for that contribution. Because innovators are the ones who not only will bring new solutions to today's problems, but they will pose different questions for tomorrow's problems. I think he sets a model for a lot of people in the manner in which he keeps a totally arm's length relationship from the exercise. He participates as chairman of the steering committee in selecting the master jury. Mm-hmm. Having selected the master jury, he gives them a full mandate and the jury is sovereign. They make their own decisions. Mm-hmm. This is the most well-studied and most documented award in the world, mm-hmm. bar none. There are dossiers prepared on each project. There are technical reviewers that go and visit the, when we narrow down the short list of projects, they go with specific questions to ask and investigate. They come back and give full detailed reports. The jury then meets and makes these decisions, listening to these reports, viewing detailed documentation on each of the projects. It is not a short commitment. There are 2 or 3 rounds. If there are 2 rounds, they're usually 1 week each. If there are 3 rounds, there may be 3 days, and then 1 week. Mm-hmm. The final one is 1 week. And there's a tremendous documentation process that goes ahead of that, with very distinguished participants who do the actual technical evaluations of the individual projects that are then subjected to scrutiny. I think, in fact, the award has kind of frustrated some people by its unwillingness to narrow down the criteria to say only local architects are to be recognized, or only international architects, foreign mm-hmm. architects to be recognized. We look at it in terms of excellence based on certain criteria. It's very hotly debated mm-hmm. By a well-balanced jury of usually around 8 or 9 people. And I think it is a tribute to the integrity of the participants and of the process that we can still come up with unanimous decisions. We had very, very tiny projects that won awards, including a small Turkish summer home which was composed of 5 unconnected semi-shed structures with a retaining wall along an embankment to the sea. Very, very small, very tiny. Towards the largest landscape project in the world, the Ankara deforestation project, 33 million trees planted over 30 years in umpteen hectares. So we've had the largest project in the world, like possibly the roof structure of the Hajj terminal in Jeddah, the size of 54 football fields. And we've had individual the construction system used in some schools from Syria, stone schools from Syria, which is a subset of a small building. So the range is absolute, and that's what makes the jury so. Well, I mean, African Trust for Culture has a number of programs. I'm not affiliated with them, so they should speak for themselves. But basically, a number of programs, including historic cities, where there's a program to restore and maintain a number of important monuments, and to help create an environment in which historic cities can be conserved in partnership with others. They also have an education program, architectural education program, which involves also an outreach effort to a number of countries, and involves gender issues as well. More broadly, the Arakan Development Network has also the Arakan University, and there's a number of other institutions associated with it as well. Then there's the World Publication arm in terms of magazines like Myanmar and others, and where there's an effort, of course, for education and outreach that addresses many of these issues. On the environmental side, clearly, and on the cultural heritage conservation side, clearly the awards have recognized those categories as very distinct aspects. I think the appropriate technology is being promoted in a number of ways. But again, the Arakan Development Network more broadly deals with some of those issues in developing countries. The award for architecture specifically, I think, has looked at appropriate technology. The very first award recognized some roofing systems for Senegal, which were, again, we talked about the building systems for the small schools. We looked at a number of building techniques that were recognized in a number of awards. In our last award, there was an outstanding project in KD in Mauritania, adjunct to a hospital, where the building construction technique of these ribbed pointed domes, domical and vaulted structures, the invention of new techniques such as the donut-shaped structures, the tear-shaped or the ovoid buildings, showed in fact a real addition to the vocabulary of the late Hassan Fathi and his disciples, which was mostly vaults and domes, to a whole array of new construction that could be done effectively and appropriately. The appropriate building technology was also recognized on the high-tech side, from the Kuwait towers in 1980 all the way down to the IBM tower in Menara Masingye in Malaysia, Ken Yang's work, which is a very environmentally conscious high-tech structure. So you have a whole range of issues that have been. Well, there is, I think, less attention has been paid to that aspect than to many others. It is probably true that the focus has been really to reverse the exclusion of hundreds of millions of poor people in the aggregate, regardless of whether they were handicapped or not. So there's not so much in terms of the individual design of buildings, although that is one of the features that is being looked at, as to whether there are ramps and appropriate access structures and so on in buildings, as one would expect state-of-the-art buildings to have today. But if you look at what the award has really done, it has raised the awareness of the world that you cannot have a situation where hundreds of millions of poor people are excluded from the main development process, and that socially responsible architecture and urban planning that works with the poor empowers them to be the producers of their own welfare and bounty, and not the recipients of charity or the beneficiaries of aid, is a process that is important. And I will be, in fact, publishing a new book that will come out in February of next year, 97, called The Architecture of Empowerment. And I'm using about 20 case studies, of which I would think around 14 or 15 are Arakan Award winners. There are some others from Latin America and Eastern Europe and so on, but There's a very surprisingly large number of them, in fact, have been American awarded. I mean, clearly gender issues are essential. There's no development that has not dealt with empowering women anywhere in the world. And certainly in developing countries, this is one of the most, if not the most, important policies to bring about real change and development. The American Award, I think, is recognized the talent of women practitioners, but has also delved in its seminars and efforts on issues of the role of women, including also looking at the sacred and the profane in particular structures. And in the Indonesia seminar, which was published as Expressions of Islam in Building, there's chapter 3, which is co-authored by Afaf Mahfouz and myself, dealing with women and space in Muslim societies, very much on these kinds of questions.
Yes. Okay. Mr. Sirajuddin, you hold some notable posts at the World Bank. I'd like to go over them with you and tell me their mandate. The first one is the environmentally sustainable development. I'd like to know your role in these projects that they actually do.
For environmentally sustainable development at the World Bank, which means I have a primary responsibility to shape the thinking of the World Bank, along, of course, with a lot of my staff, not me personally, but I supervise the staff that do so, about these issues, and to make sure that this gets translated into the operations of the regional parts of the bank. The bank is organized by geographic region, and to bring back the lessons that all these people from Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, East Asia, South Asia, etc., are confronting as problems, so that we can share experiences, promote best practices, and learn from that. And in the end, to maintain a global overview so that it doesn't become 6 separate banks, but remains a single World Bank that benefits from the richness of this experience in order to support each of the individual countries, member countries concerned in their development efforts. So that's my major function as Vice President for Environmentally Sustainable Development. And that includes environmental sustainability, social sustainability, as well as, of course, economic and financial. The Consultative Group to Assist the Poorest, or CGAP, is a microfinance program that is intended to recognize and promote efforts to deal with the very poor through microfinance. And one of the most famous examples of that would be the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. The question is why we can't get more of around the world of such examples that really reach very poor people. Incidentally, the Grameen Bank has a very successful housing program as well, which won an Aga Khan Award in 1989. So in architecture, not just in finance. So the CGAP is dealing with the promotion of best practice to deal with these issues. The Global Water Partnership is a recently created body which is trying, in fact, to bring together the financiers of technical assistance to developing countries in order to help coordinate the kind of interventions they do so that water is treated in a more holistic fashion. Right now, treatment of water in most countries is very fragmented. People look at it as irrigation, people look at it as municipal water, people look at it as input or output from industry, people look at it from environmental and wetland issues. And the basic natural unit is the river basin, both hydrologically and watershed-wise. And in fact, these competing uses have to be brought together. And frequently, many of the watersheds not only cut across the agency lines that deal with these issues, or the sectoral lines, they also cut across political boundaries. 40% of the world's population lives on rivers that are shared by more than 2 countries. So what we need to do is to have a more holistic approach that recognizes that we can't waste water, but we have to treat it as a basic human need, but also as a scarce commodity that has to be properly husbanded. And we expect that this will help gear and orient the roughly $60 to $80 billion worth of investment that will ultimately go to developing countries, although what it will focus on will be not the actual investments, but the context in which each investment is evaluated. Well, I think there are many obstacles, but among the most important are, of course, increased investments in people, education, health, nutrition. We're moving very rapidly to a situation in the world where we're moving towards a knowledge-based society, knowledge-based production economy. And those countries that are nimble, that are capable of absorbing knowledge and applying it very rapidly and developing their own knowledge base will be those that can in fact effectively compete in an increasingly globalized world. So that's got to be a part, and it means both investment in people as well as institutions. We need to worry about the fact that rising inequities within nations and between nations will fray the social contract that holds a society together. And we see the fraying of social contract leads to disintegration of societies, where you can't talk about development, whether it's a relatively advanced country like Yugoslavia or a relatively poor country like Somalia. They both disintegrate. You can't really deal with development issues in that context. I think also that above and beyond that, there's a very, very essential part, which is agricultural research. I am also the chairman of the consultative group for international agricultural research. And why I say this is because people tend to forget that the primary interface between human beings and the environment is agriculture. 70% of the land, almost 70 to 85, 90% of the water in developing countries is used for agriculture, or misused, inappropriately used. You're going to have at least 2 to 3 billion more people on the planet in the next generation. 95% of them will be in the developing countries. Unless agriculture is transformed, the forests will be chopped down, the hillsides will be colonized, the soil will be eroded, the water will be parched. And therefore that transformation becomes essential to improve rural incomes, to increase food security, and to protect the environment, as well as, incidentally, food security for the urban poor and the landless farm workers, because by definition they purchase their food, they don't grow it. And therefore cheap food becomes an essential part of helping them as well. And all of that part of sustainable agricultural food security will require a whole constellation of policies, but it will also require agricultural research, and that's why I'm working with the CGIAR as well. Well, I mean, sharing the wealth is too strong a word. I mean, we now have a situation where the industrialized countries, the top 20% of humanity, roughly corresponding to the industrialized countries, receive 83% of the world's income. The remaining 80% receive 17% of the world's income. And the bottom 20% receive only 1.4% of the world's income, less than 1.5%. Now, 30 years ago, in 1960, the top 20% was 30 times as wealthy as the bottom 20%. Today, it is 60 times as wealthy. And that top wealthy part says it cannot afford to give 0.3 of 1% of GNP. 0.3 of 1% of GNP to the poor. So we're a long way from sharing the wealth. I mean, 0.3 of 1% of their 83% of the world.
That's staggering.
It is. These are staggering statistics.
Yes.
That's the reality in which we're dealing. So there's got to be a major effort in the developing world to improve their own well-being, to take charge of their destiny, by empowering the poor, both in terms of the built environment as well as economic well-being. And to recognize that even though you may have a very limited amount in per capita income measured in cash, you can have a very high proportion of the same social well-being. So that for roughly $1,500 per capita, you can have about 85 to 90% of all the social indicators in terms of nutrition, life expectancy, etc., that other countries achieve with $23,000, $24,000 per capita. And that means focusing on the needs of children, of the poor, focusing on empowerment of women. It means creating healthy environments, adequate access to water and sanitation for most of the population, and that is fully feasible even with limited incomes. But I think we need to revisit a lot of that, and we continue to be advocates for a much greater increase in this tiny, tiny trickle that the rich countries find already too much. You know, all international agencies confront realities of what they can do is really the sum of what their individual member states would enable them to do and empower them to do. I think the UN Development Program, UNDP, has some very dedicated individuals, as do other international agencies. And in the end, though, the role of all agencies, international agencies, all external expertise, is purely supportive. Those who create the well-being, the success stories we talk about, like East Asia and so on, those who create that are the people in those countries themselves. The outsiders can provide support and help in a timely fashion, but in the end, the process has to be owned, designed, produced domestically in each country. I think, the Gorna project was flawed in terms of the economic base, in the sense that many of the people who were trying to be moved to New Gorna were not really farmers to start with, so there were some problems with that. But fundamentally, this is not the significance of Gorna. The real significance of Hassan Fathi's contribution is that the ideas he brought forward, which were counter to the mainstream thinking in architecture in the world, turned out to be the right ideas. By that I mean the following. Remember that from the 1920s, the thinking had been that industrial processes we're going to apply industrial processes to solve the housing problem. The Weissenhof-Siedlung program, the workers' housing, the slab blocks that were being created everywhere, Le Corbusier's Maison est une machine à habiter, and so on. This obsession with the machine, Hassan Fathi countered that with a profound humanism, saying that architecture is about people. It is not a machine. It's not creating a cookie-cutter approach in which you fit people afterwards. It is very much by empowering people to participate in the process. That was a revolutionary idea. And he was branded the romantic. He also talked about environmental issues. He talked about using indigenous materials. He talked about guided self-help. He talked about testing the validity of designs, including shapes and forms, against thermal coefficients, whether they were effective for the environment in which they worked. He talked, above all, I think, in respecting the wisdom of inherited tradition, not throwing it out, but he was not averse to changing it and learning from it. In fact, he moved some of the designs from Kenya to the Delta. I mean, he was not sort of a purist in that sense, and he was quite willing to innovate. But all of these ideas have now been so widely accepted that we tend to forget how revolutionary they were when he started saying them in the 30s and 40s. Mm-hmm. And that is the real significance of his contributions, not the individual aspects of a single project, like Gorna or like Paris or like any of the others. First of all, I think we have to go back and recognize three separate parts of that question. The first is that mud brick building of any kind is one that requires a lot of maintenance. And at the moment that you stop having this maintenance, they become susceptible to degradation very rapidly, especially in cases of rain. And secondly, that although mud brick building today is extremely expensive because of the high labor content, back in the 1940s, when it was being designed, it was not expensive. So it made sense in that context. It wouldn't make sense today. And that's one of the reasons why, ironically, you find the so-called Fathi style being used as vacation homes for the wealthy in everything from Sharm el-Sheikh to the north coast to Santa Fe as well. No, but that's separate. So there is an issue of maintenance, and mud brick requires a lot of maintenance by living residents who know what they're doing. This is not unique to these projects. If you go back to many of the projects in places like Yemen, for example, it had a remarkably successful tradition of building. When that aspect of the individual maintenance of buildings was lost for a variety of reasons, such as movement of the owners, displacement, invasion, succession by tenants who didn't care or didn't feel responsible, or a sense that it was now going to be a government responsibility as to their own, and so on, many of these buildings have degraded. So that's the two parts of the first question, that the material itself is susceptible to that. Secondly, the context in which it should be judged is not in the late 1990s, it is in fact the late 40s, so it's 50 years later. The contexts were different, the price relativities were different between materials and construction methods and the like. The third aspect is that this is a project that has been controversial from the start. I mentioned it was flawed from its economic base, and as a result, the kind of inhabitants that were intended to to be the primary residence did not fully take root, and there were all sorts of other reasons associated with that. Now, you can judge that particular project in that debate, but I think it doesn't in any way invalidate the overall greatness of the contributions of Hassan Fathy in terms of the ideas and the alternative paradigm to architecture that he put forward. And I would add one more thing which I didn't mention. His concern with the rural. Mm-hmm. At a time when the idea of architects was all towards the cities and the big buildings and so on, he still expressed a concern with the rural. And in his day, it was a lot more relevant. As we speak today, in 1996, for the next 20 years, the majority of the population of the developing world will still be rural. It is only after 2015 that for the first time the majority in the developing world will become urban. So we're talking about a long-range situation, and Hassan Fathy certainly in the 1940s was absolutely right in calling attention to the problems of architecture for the poor and the rural poor, which tended to be forgotten, but also to call attention to learning from the exquisite vernacular architecture. And as he used to tell us, not everything that is imported is automatically good, and not everything that we have is automatically bad. Choose from between them and use criteria such as environmental adequacy in terms of thermal properties, as well as the economics of building, as well as its relevance to the people. These were the kinds of questions that I think we need to take into account. No, I think they both won on their intrinsic merits. There's no question that Ramses Wissa Wasif's work at Haramaya, and specifically the Habib Gorgi Museum of Sculpture, is an outstanding masterpiece. There are few pieces that are as masterful as that. And Ramses Wissa Wasif was not really a disciple of Hassan Fathy. He was a collaborator, mm-hmm. a partner, a colleague, a friend. They were approximately the same age. Mm-hmm. I was the chairman of the jury that awarded that in '83. And I can tell you, the late Charles Moore, a lot of us felt that this was really a true masterpiece and deserved to be recognized. The use of light, the studied casualness of the plan, all of that is a remarkable achievement. It's not at all a copy of Hassan Fathy, it's an intrinsic original. The only regret is that, unlike Hassan Bey, who God gave him enough longevity to live to see the recognition that he mm-hmm. got, the award to Wissa Wasif was posthumous.
Yes.
And but it was recognized as a true masterpiece in its own right. El-Wakil, likewise, I think the works that he presented were deemed by the juries, both in 1980 in the Halawa House and subsequently in the Corniche Mosque and so on, as speaking to something unique and excellent in the expression of a particular building. He went on to do a lot of things that were very different from Hassan Fathy, but he is a master builder in his own right, in a very traditionalist school, even if the Miqat Mosque is an unusual triangular minaret, mm-hmm. but by and large he's a traditionalist, or a classicist if you prefer. And he has become a form giver for much of the, or form ascertainer for much of the mosque building that was done. Rather than go into that building by building, whether it's Portuguese or Gilbert or others, this issue of designing by Muslims and non-Muslims is not really a relevant issue. I pointed out in lectures in Cairo University when there was questions on this point. I said, the audience in Cairo, 400 people there were debating this. I said, look, nobody would deny that the Ibn Tulun Mosque is an important part of the Muslim cultural heritage of Egypt, if not of the world. Mm-hmm. Of the world, it's important. It was built by a Christian architect. If you look at that mosque, it was built by, if you look at the history books, it says Ahmad ibn Tulun got Banna Nasrani to build that mosque for him. So the fact that whether they are sultans or they are emirs or khalifas or contemporary people, and they get, or Muslim communities for that matter, they go and get some of the best talent to do that work for them. I think there are some of different varieties, but some of the mosques you're talking about, of course, are built in Western capitals. And in that sense, of course, the level of interaction is also important. I would think one has to judge each on its own. That's a masterpiece. The Arania is a masterpiece because it only went far enough to give a vocabulary to the local inhabitants, created a plinth on which they could build their own housing. They used some of these examples, they did other things if they wanted. But above all, it overcame the tendency towards strife by allowing members of different communities and mixing them up roughly in proportion to their 70% Hindu, 12% Muslim, 8% Jain, etc., etc. But forcing them to work together as neighbors, and as a result create the sense of community that is unusual in that development. It's a marvelous example of the architecture of empowerment, and Doshi should be complimented.